My name is Pedro, I'm 30 years old, and I'm going to tell you a story that completely changed my perspective on life. To this day, when I close my eyes, I can still smell the humid air of that place, hear the echo of my own footsteps, and feel the weight of absolute darkness surrounding me. It all started 3 years ago, when I was going through one of the worst periods of my life. I had lost my job, my girlfriend had broken up with me, and I felt completely lost. It was as if the entire world was collapsing on me, you know? That feeling that nothing made sense anymore, and that I was just wandering through life without any direction. At that time, I had the habit of taking long walks to clear my mind. It was my way of dealing with the stress and anxiety that consumed me daily. Usually, I walked through the same familiar places, but on that specific day, something inside me called for adventure, for something different that could take my mind off that vicious cycle of negative thoughts. I decided to explore an area I had never visited before. It was a more remote region, with hills covered in dense vegetation and some interesting rock formations. The place had a wild, almost untouched air that somehow attracted me. Maybe that was exactly what I needed at that moment, to escape civilization and connect with something more primitive and real. I walked for about 2 hours, following poorly defined trails and letting my intuition guide me. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange and reddish tones that created an almost magical atmosphere. That's when I spotted something that immediately sparked my curiosity. An opening in the rock, partially hidden by branches and foliage. As I approached, I realized it was the entrance to some kind of tunnel or cave. The opening was large enough for a person to pass through, but it was so well camouflaged by vegetation that it would be easy to walk by without noticing. Something about that place intrigued me deeply. It was as if I was being called to enter, as if that dark hole held answers to questions I didn't even know I was asking. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The light revealed a tunnel that extended beyond what I could see. The walls were natural stone, smooth in some places and irregular in others. The floor seemed stable, and there were no immediate signs of danger. My rational mind told me to leave, that exploring an unknown tunnel alone was a terrible idea. But something stronger than reason pushed me inside. I entered. The first few meters were calm. The tunnel was relatively straight and wide, allowing me to walk upright without difficulty. The air was fresh, and there was a slight current, which reassured me somewhat, as it indicated there was another exit somewhere. My footsteps echoed softly off the stone walls, creating a rhythmic sound that somehow calmed me. As I advanced, I began to notice that the tunnel was starting to slope gently downward. It wasn't a steep descent, but it was noticeable. At first, this didn't worry me much. Many natural caves have this type of formation. What began to make me uncomfortable was realizing that the tunnel was gradually getting narrower. After about 15 minutes of walking, I stopped to assess the situation. I looked back and could still see a faint light coming from the entrance, which gave me a sense of security. Ahead, the darkness seemed infinite, completely swallowing the light from my phone a few meters forward. It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to continue for just a few more minutes, just to satisfy my curiosity. What a terrible mistake. I continued advancing, and the tunnel began to make gentle curves, first to the left, then to the right. With each curve, I lost a little more reference to the entrance. But there was something hypnotizing about that underground journey. The absolute silence, broken only by my footsteps and breathing, created an almost meditative atmosphere. It was as if I was leaving behind not just the outside world, but also all my problems and worries. That's when it happened. I was focused on illuminating the path ahead when I heard a sound behind me. A low sound, like stones moving. I turned quickly, pointing the phone's light in the direction where it had come from. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. Stones, Many stones had collapsed, completely blocking the path I had taken. The tunnel was sealed behind me. For a few seconds, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. It was impossible. I had just passed through there. The tunnel was perfectly stable. How could this have happened? I ran to the pile of rocks and began pushing the smaller ones, desperately trying to open a passage. But it was useless. The stones were solidly fitted, and some were too large for me to move alone. Panic began to take hold of me. My heart raced. My breathing became accelerated and irregular. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there was no signal. I was underground, in the middle of nowhere. The reality of my situation began to weigh on me like a mountain. I was trapped, alone, in a dark tunnel, and no one knew where I was. I tried to calm myself, breathing deeply and thinking rationally. If the tunnel had air current, as I had noticed before, that meant there was another exit. I just needed to keep going forward and find it. Simple as that. Or at least that's what I tried to convince myself. I started walking again, but now each step was loaded with anxiety. With every meter I advanced, the darkness seemed to get denser, more oppressive. The tunnel continued its gradual descent, and the walls seemed to be slowly approaching. It wasn't my imagination. The space was really getting tighter. After what seemed like hours, but was probably just another 15 or 20 minutes, I reached a point where I needed to crouch to continue. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it echoing off the walls. Fear was beginning to transform into something more primitive, more visceral. It was as if my body was preparing for a threat that my mind couldn't yet fully comprehend. It was at this point that I made a disturbing discovery. When examining the walls more closely with the phone's light, I noticed there were strange marks on the stone. They weren't natural formations. They seemed to have been made by tools, as if someone had deliberately dug that tunnel. But this didn't make sense. Who would make such a tunnel, leading nowhere? I continued advancing, now practically crawling. The ceiling was so low that I needed to keep my head down all the time. My neck began to hurt, my back was tense, and my knees were already scraped from dragging across the rough floor. But there was no choice. I had to continue. And then, when I was beginning to lose hope, I saw something that filled me with relief. Light. A faint clarity, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere ahead. My heart filled with hope. It was the exit. I had made it, ignoring the pain in my back and knees. I crawled as fast as I could toward that saving light. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't exactly an exit. It was a circular opening in the tunnel ceiling, through which very faint light entered. Looking up, I could see it was some kind of vertical shaft that rose for several meters. The light coming from above was so faint it barely illuminated the space around me. I analyzed the situation. The shaft was too narrow for me to climb, and even if it were possible, there was nowhere to grip on the smooth walls. Besides, I had no idea how high it was or where it led. It could be a natural opening on the surface, or some kind of abandoned construction. Either way, it didn't offer me a viable escape route. But there was something more intriguing about that place. Around the base of the shaft, the space opened into a small circular chamber. It was the first place since I entered the tunnel where I could stand completely upright. And that's when I made a discovery that changed everything. Scattered across the chamber floor were objects. Objects that clearly didn't belong in that place. An old, dusty backpack, an empty water bottle, some rusted food cans, and most disturbing of all, a notebook deteriorated by moisture. With trembling hands, I picked up the notebook and opened it carefully. The pages were damaged, but it was still possible to read parts of the content. It was a diary, written by someone who, like me, had been trapped in that tunnel. The first entries were dated about 10 years ago. Day 1. Found an interesting tunnel during my walk. decided to explore it, but the entrance collapsed behind me. I'm trying to find another exit. Day 3. Still haven't found an exit. I'm rationing the water I brought with me. Must stay calm and keep looking. Day 7. Explored all the tunnel branches I could find. They all lead to dead ends or become too narrow to pass through. I'm starting to get worried. Day 12. My flashlight broke today. I'm using candles I brought in my backpack, but they won't last long. The darkness here is different from anything I've ever experienced. It's as if it were alive. The entries continued for several pages, each one more desperate than the last. The person who wrote that had spent weeks trapped in that place, slowly losing hope and sanity. The last entries were almost illegible, written with trembling, erratic handwriting. Day 28. I hear voices in the walls. I know there's no one here, but the voices are very real to me. They tell me secrets about this place, about why it exists. Day 30. I understand now. This place isn't natural. It was created with a purpose, and that purpose hasn't been fulfilled yet. Day 32. The voices are louder now. They tell me others will come, that they always come. The tunnel calls them, just as it called me. It's a cycle that cannot be broken. The last entry was the most disturbing of all. Day 35. I'm not going to get out of here. I accept that now, but maybe I can help the next one who comes. I'll leave these notes as a warning. If you're reading this, I'm sorry. You're trapped in the same cycle, but there's a way to break the chain. The secret is in the walls. Look for the symbols. My mind was in turmoil. Symbols? What symbols? And what happened to the person who wrote that? Where was the body? I looked around the chamber with new urgency, searching for any sign of symbols on the walls. That's when I noticed them, carved into the chamber walls. Almost imperceptible in the gloom, were small symbols etched into the stone. They were simple, almost primitive. Circles, straight lines, connected dots. They seemed to form some kind of pattern, but I couldn't decipher it. I grabbed my phone, which still had about 40% battery, and began photographing each symbol I found. There were dozens of them, scattered across all the chamber walls. Some were more worn than others, as if they had been made at different times. While studying the symbols, I began to perceive an emerging pattern. They weren't randomly distributed. There was a sequence, a logic behind their arrangement. And in the center of the north wall, there was a symbol larger than the others, more elaborate. It seemed to be a combination of all the smaller elements. Instinctively, I touched the central symbol. The stone was strangely warm under my fingers, contrasting with the general cold of the place. And then, something extraordinary happened. The wall began to move. It didn't collapse or crack. It literally moved, sliding to the side with a soft sound of stone against stone. Behind it, a passage was revealed that I hadn't noticed before. A passage that led upward toward the surface. For a moment, I was paralyzed by surprise and relief. Was it real? Or was my mind, stressed by fear and deprivation, beginning to create illusions? I touched the passage with my hands to make sure it was solid, real. It was. Without hesitating, I began to climb through the passage. It was steep, but not impossible to navigate. With each meter I climbed, the air became fresher and I could feel a gentle breeze touching my face. After about 10 minutes of careful climbing, I finally saw the most beautiful thing in the world, the starry night sky. I emerged from the passage in a completely different area from where I had entered. I was on top of a hill, overlooking a valley I didn't recognize, but I didn't care. I was free. I breathed the night air deeply, filling my lungs with freedom. I looked at my phone. It was almost 3 in the morning. I had spent more than 8 hours trapped in that tunnel. It felt like an eternity. Using the phone's GPS, I managed to orient myself and find the way back home. Throughout the entire way back, my mind was buzzing with questions. What were those symbols? How did they trigger the opening of the secret passage? And more importantly, who had created that system? And why? In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the experience. I researched everything I could about tunnels, caves, and ancient symbols, but found nothing that resembled what I had seen. It was as if that place existed outside the known world, but the experience had changed something fundamental in me. The problems that seemed so overwhelming before my adventure, unemployment, the breakup, the feeling of being lost in life, suddenly seemed smaller, more manageable. I had faced my most primitive fear, claustrophobia, and the fear of death, and had come out the other side. A week later, I got a new job. 2 weeks after that, I met someone special. I'm not saying the tunnel had magical powers or anything like that, but the experience gave me a different perspective on resilience, on my ability to face challenges that seemed impossible. But there was one issue that continued to haunt me: the diary I had found. The person who wrote it had spent more than a month trapped in that place, and apparently never managed to get out. How had I managed to find the exit so quickly? And where was that person's body? I decided to go back. 3 months after my first experience, I returned to the location. This time I was well prepared. I brought food, water, extra flashlights, ropes, and even left a note for a friend explaining where I would be, just as a precaution. The original tunnel entrance was still blocked by stones, but now I knew the secret exit. I entered through it and descended to the circular chamber. Everything was exactly as I had left it. The old backpack, the rusted cans, the notebook. But there was something new, or rather, something I had missed the first time. In the darkest corner of the chamber, partially hidden by a rock ledge, were bones. Human bones, clean and whitened by time. Next to them, a deteriorated but still readable ID card. The name corresponded to the first page of the diary. I then understood the terrible truth about that place. The person who had written the diary had really died there, trapped, alone, in the darkness. But somehow, through those mysterious symbols, they had managed to leave an exit for the next ones who would come. They had broken the cycle, as written in their last entry. I collected the bones with reverence and buried them properly in a beautiful location near the secret entrance. It was the least I could do for someone who, even in death, had found a way to save others. But the question remained: who had created that symbol system? And why did the tunnel seem to call people into it? I spent months researching on the internet, in libraries, talking with experts in archaeology and speleology. Finally, I found a clue in an obscure book about local legends of the region. According to legend, hundreds of years ago, a group of people had created a series of tests or trials scattered throughout the region. They weren't malicious traps, but rather challenges designed to make people confront their deepest fears and emerge transformed. The tunnel was one of these tests. The idea was simple. People who were lost in life, facing existential crises, would naturally be attracted to these places. There, they would be forced to confront their fears and limitations. Those who managed to overcome the challenge would emerge stronger. Those who couldn't, well, at least they would contribute to helping the next ones, as happened with me. It was an ancient form of therapy, a way to force personal growth through controlled adversity. Primitive, dangerous, but effective for those who survived. Today, 3 years later, my life is completely transformed. I have a great job, a healthy relationship, and a much more mature perspective on life's challenges. But most importantly, I lost the fear. Not completely, of course, but I learned that I can face situations that seem impossible and find a way out. Sometimes, I still have nightmares about that oppressive darkness, about the sound of stones collapsing behind me. But these nightmares always end the same way, with me finding the light and emerging stronger. I never returned to the tunnel after that second visit. I sealed the secret entrance with stones and branches, not to prevent others from finding the place, but to ensure that only those who really needed the challenge could access it. After all, I believe the tunnel still has a purpose to fulfill. And if you're going through a difficult time in life, if you feel lost and without direction, maybe you should pay attention to the signs around you. Maybe there's a challenge waiting for you, an opportunity to grow through adversity. I just don't recommend going looking for dark tunnels alone. There are much safer ways to face our fears. But if by chance you find yourself in an impossible situation, trapped in your own metaphorical darkness, remember the lesson I learned in that tunnel. There's always a way out. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes you need to look for symbols and clues that others left behind. But there's always a way out. You just need to have the courage to look for it.